Before we dive in, don't forget to hit subscribe for more thrilling stories like this. The city never slept, and neither did Victoria. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her modest apartment, staring at the glittering skyline of New York. The lights seemed beautiful from a distance, but up close, they were cold and unforgiving, much like the life she had been living. At 26, she had already learned that survival often required hard choices, sacrifices that left scars invisible to the world. But tonight, she was on the brink of a choice that could change everything. Victoria had always been ambitious, and perhaps a little reckless. She had a plan, a dangerous, audacious plan, but it was the kind of plan only someone desperate enough to risk it all could conceive. Alexander Blackwood, the billionaire whose name dominated business headlines, had everything: wealth, power, influence. But he was untouchable, surrounded by layers of security and a reputation that could crush anyone who dared to cross him. That was exactly why Victoria had to get close. Not for love, not for companionship, but for leverage. A marriage, carefully orchestrated, would give her access to a world most only dreamed of. She had studied him for months, his habits, his preferences, his schedule. Every public appearance, every article, every interview was catalogued in meticulous detail. Alexander Blackwood was a man who demanded control, a man who ruled his empire with precision, yet he had blind spots. He trusted very few, and those he did were either too loyal or too intimidated to see beyond the man he portrayed. Victoria intended to use that trust. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. A charity gala, one of those meticulously curated events designed to project Alexander's philanthropic side, was her stage. She arrived in a flowing midnight blue gown that hugged her figure without revealing too much, her hair pinned elegantly, her demeanor a perfect balance of confidence and charm. The moment she walked into the room, she felt the weight of 100 eyes, some curious, some envious, but hers were locked on a single target across the room. Alexander noticed her immediately. It wasn't often that someone entered his sphere with such quiet authority. She didn't approach with desperation or flattery, and that intrigued him. In a room full of people vying for his attention, she had something different, calm, precise, deliberate. He watched as she navigated the crowd, speaking politely, laughing lightly, but always observing. She was aware of him, and yet she made him work for the acknowledgement. That small tension, that subtle game, drew him in before either of them realized it. Their first conversation was brief but electric. They spoke about art, philanthropy, the absurdities of high society. Alexander was amused by her wit, intrigued by her intelligence, but more than anything, he noticed the edge beneath her charm. She was playing a role, of course, he knew women in his world often did, but there was something authentic, something unpredictable in her presence that stirred a curiosity he hadn't felt in years. Victoria, meanwhile, had to remind herself to breathe. She could feel the electricity between them, a dangerous force that could ruin her plan if she let it. She was not here to fall in love. She was here to marry power, to secure a future that had always seemed just out of reach. Yet, in that fleeting connection, she felt something she had long suppressed, an unfamiliar flutter, the smallest crack in her carefully constructed armor. She couldn't afford distractions, and yet distraction found her anyway. As the night progressed, Alexander found excuses to stay near her, to engage in casual conversation, to laugh at her jokes and challenge her ideas. Victoria mirrored his interest, careful to maintain the perfect balance of intrigue and distance. She was aware of the eyes around them, of the whispered rumors that started forming as others noticed their interaction, but she ignored it. This was chess, not romance, and every move mattered. By the end of the evening, Alexander had asked for her number, a simple request that held the weight of 1,000 possibilities. Victoria handed it over with a calm smile, her mind racing. This was the opening she had been waiting for, the first step into a world that could either elevate her beyond her wildest dreams or destroy her completely. As she left the gala, she felt the thrill of power mixing with a dangerous uncertainty. She was playing with fire, and Alexander Blackwood was about to become her greatest risk, and perhaps her greatest obsession. Back in her apartment, Victoria sat at her desk, reviewing every detail of the night. Every word, every gesture, every glance was recorded in her mind like notes on a ledger. She had the leverage she needed, but she also had a storm she didn't fully understand brewing between them. One night, one conversation, and already the rules of her carefully controlled plan were bending. She knew the game had just begun, and that she would need all her wit, courage, and charm to survive it. Little did she know, the man she intended to manipulate was about to become the one who would test her limits in ways she had never imagined. The billionaire had his own rules, his own desires, and a single touch from her could set in motion a chain of events neither of them could control. Victoria thought she was the player, but the night had only just started, and the game was far more dangerous, and far more intoxicating, than she could have anticipated. The morning after the gala, Victoria woke with the sensation of both triumph and unease. The plan had begun perfectly. Alexander had noticed her, shown interest, and unknowingly allowed her a foothold into his meticulously guarded world. Yet, as she sipped her coffee, the weight of what she was attempting settled over her like a shadow. She wasn't just entering Alexander's life, she was stepping into a storm, one where the rules were defined by a man used to controlling everything. She reminded herself that charm and intellect were her weapons, and restraint was her shield. She could not falter. Alexander, meanwhile, was already reviewing the night in his mind, a rare feeling gnawing at him. Normally, he could dissect interactions, predict reactions, and manipulate outcomes with surgical precision. But Victoria was different. Her presence lingered like smoke in his mind, tantalizing and dangerous. He found himself replaying her every word, her subtle smile, the way her eyes seemed to calculate and observe simultaneously. He knew immediately that she wasn't just another socialite vying for his attention or a business opportunist trying to gain leverage. There was something real, something defiant in her, and it both intrigued and unnerved him. Within days, their paths crossed again, this time in a more controlled environment, a high-profile business luncheon at one of the city's most exclusive hotels. Alexander was a master at public appearances, always composed, always commanding attention, and Victoria had to maintain her role carefully. She arrived a few minutes early, choosing a seat that allowed her a clear view of him without appearing eager. When he entered the room, all eyes turned, but he noticed her first, and that small recognition, the subtle lift of his brow, made her pulse quicken despite herself. Their conversation was polite but charged with unspoken tension. Alexander asked questions about her career, her ambitions, her opinions on matters of finance and philanthropy, all framed casually, almost teasingly. Victoria answered with precision, careful not to reveal too much, yet revealing enough to spark his curiosity. Every laugh, every glance, every nuanced expression was calculated, not to manipulate him emotionally, but to keep him off balance, intrigued, and guessing. She had to remind herself constantly that the endgame was not romance, it was access, leverage, and ultimately, control. Yet control was proving to be a more fluid concept than she had anticipated. Alexander's presence was magnetic, his gaze intense and commanding, his voice smooth and confident, carrying authority that demanded attention. She could feel the tension in the air each time they were near one another, an invisible force pulling them together even as she reminded herself to remain detached. She began to notice the little things, the slight curl of his lips when amused, the subtle flicker of interest in his eyes, the way he listened intently when she spoke, as though every word mattered more than it should. It was disconcerting because, in her world, power was measured in strategy and influence, not fleeting emotion. Victoria also began to see the cracks in Alexander's armor. Despite his polished exterior, she glimpsed impatience, a restlessness, a rare vulnerability that appeared only when he was caught off guard. She noted it mentally, catalogued it, but didn't exploit it, not yet. She knew that gaining his trust would take time, and that rushing could expose her motives prematurely. Every interaction became a careful dance, a blend of engagement and distance, where she had to charm without revealing, tease without yielding, and intrigue without surrendering. Meanwhile, Alexander found himself compelled to understand her, to figure her out. He wasn't used to someone resisting his influence, someone who could challenge him intellectually and emotionally without appearing contrived. She asked questions that pushed him to explain, to justify, to reveal glimpses of his thoughts that few had access to. And when she smiled at something subtle he said, something only he would understand, he felt a rare spark of connection, one that unsettled him in ways he didn't expect. The notion that she might not just be another social climber, that she might actually be authentic, lingered uncomfortably in his mind. Days turned into weeks, and their encounters became more frequent. Business meetings, charity events, chance coincidences, at upscale cafes, each carefully orchestrated by Victoria or chance, she sometimes couldn't tell the difference. With every interaction, the invisible tension between them grew, a force neither could ignore. Yet, while Alexander found himself drawn to her unpredictability and subtle allure, Victoria struggled with her own reactions. She had not anticipated the way he would affect her, not merely as a target of her scheme, but as a man whose presence stirred feelings she had long buried beneath ambition and pragmatism. Then came the invitation she had been waiting for, a private dinner at Alexander's penthouse. It was framed as a business discussion, a courtesy extended to someone he wanted to know better in a more intimate setting. Victoria accepted, aware that this was both an opportunity and a test. She spent hours preparing, selecting her attire, planning her words, rehearsing the balance of charm and caution. But as she arrived, stepping into the space that exuded luxury, power, and command, she felt the first real pangs of uncertainty. This was a world where missteps could be costly, and every glance, every word, every gesture would be scrutinized. Alexander greeted her at the door with a mix of casual ease and subtle intensity that made her heart skip a beat. He led her to a dining area that overlooked the city, the skyline glittering beneath them, the night air filled with anticipation. Conversation flowed effortlessly at first, touching on work, ambitions, and their perspectives on life. But as the dinner progressed, the tone shifted imperceptibly. The air between them thickened with unspoken tension, a silent acknowledgement that there was more than business at play. Victoria could feel it in the way he studied her, the slight hesitation in his responses, the faint smile that didn't quite hide a spark of interest, or perhaps a challenge. By dessert, the line between strategy and desire had blurred, though neither would admit it aloud. Victoria's mind raced, weighing every move, considering every implication. She had to remain the orchestrator, the player who pulled the strings, yet the proximity of Alexander, his commanding presence, and the subtle warmth in his attention made restraint increasingly difficult. She realized that the plan she had meticulously constructed was no longer entirely under her control. The stakes had escalated, and the danger was no longer just strategic, it was personal. As the evening ended and she prepared to leave, Alexander walked her to the door, the silence between them heavy with meaning. For the first time, Victoria felt a flicker of vulnerability, an acknowledgement that this game, this plan, was evolving in ways she hadn't foreseen. And as she stepped out into the cool night air, her pulse still racing, she knew one thing with certainty: the Billionaire's rules were about to be challenged, and neither of them would emerge unchanged. Victoria couldn't stop thinking about that dinner. The way Alexander had looked at her, the intensity in his gaze that seemed to pierce through every layer she had so carefully constructed, had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Normally, she prided herself on keeping emotions in check, on viewing relationships and interactions through a lens of strategy and calculation. But Alexander Blackwood was different. He was magnetic, commanding, and the kind of man whose presence alone made people rethink their priorities, even those who prided themselves on logic and control. Victoria realized that her carefully plotted plan, marriage for leverage, was already starting to feel like a living, unpredictable thing. Over the next few days, she continued her routine meticulously, yet every call, every email, every interaction with Alexander carried an undercurrent of tension she could not ignore. He had invited her to join him at a charity board meeting, ostensibly to discuss her input on a philanthropic initiative. The meeting was high profile, attended by the city's elite, and Victoria knew that each word she spoke, each glance she made, would be noticed, dissected, and remembered. But she was prepared. She had studied him, the organization, the attendees, and her own strategy, and yet, no preparation could have readied her for the subtle power struggle that seemed to exist between them, a silent game of influence where neither wanted to show weakness. Alexander, on his part, was becoming increasingly aware of the dangerous effect Victoria had on him. He was a man accustomed to control of his business empire, control of his public image, control of every aspect of his carefully curated life. Yet, with Victoria, control seemed to slip through his fingers. She had a way of speaking, of smiling, of positioning herself in his presence that was entirely calculated yet disarmingly real. She challenged him intellectually, provoked him subtly, and at the same time, maintained a composure that suggested she was untouchable, untamed, and yet completely aware of the power she wielded. For the first time in years, Alexander found himself on edge, anticipating her next move, craving her attention, and dreading the possibilities of what might happen if he let himself be drawn in. During the meeting, Victoria's charm and intelligence shone. She made suggestions that were insightful, sometimes challenging the status quo, and Alexander observed quietly as others reacted, impressed, intrigued, some even envious of the confidence she exuded. He felt an unusual sense of pride, an odd satisfaction in seeing her navigate this complex social and professional landscape, yet underneath it all, a dangerous curiosity stirred within him. He began to wonder what she was capable of, how far she would go, and what her ultimate intentions truly were. The line between admiration and desire blurred, and he found himself more captivated by her unpredictability than he wanted to admit. After the meeting, Alexander suggested they continue the conversation privately. Victoria agreed, knowing this was both a risk and an opportunity. As they stepped into the quiet of his private office, the city skyline casting a glittering backdrop behind them, the tension between them was palpable. He poured 2 glasses of wine, handed her one, and for a moment, they simply stood in silence, the kind of silence that was heavy with unspoken words. Victoria felt her heartbeat quicken, aware that this was no longer just a professional interaction, it was a subtle, dangerous dance of attraction, power, and curiosity. Alexander broke the silence with a question that seemed innocuous, but carried weight. Why are you really here, Victoria? I mean, beyond the work, beyond the events, why do you keep appearing in my world? His eyes were fixed on hers, searching for the truth behind the carefully constructed facade she maintained. Victoria met his gaze steadily, offering a calm smile, yet inside, her mind raced. She couldn't reveal the full truth, not yet. Not when everything she had worked for depended on maintaining the perfect balance of charm, intelligence, and detachment. I'm here because I believe in what you're building, she said, choosing her words carefully. And I think there's a lot we can accomplish together. It was true, in a way. She did believe in her own plan, in the possibilities that Alexander's world offered her, but it was a half-truth designed to protect her ultimate agenda. He studied her closely, as though trying to decipher the hidden layers behind her calm exterior. You're interesting, he said finally, a small smirk forming on his lips. Not like anyone I've ever met. There was admiration in his tone, but also a challenge, an acknowledgement that she was playing a game that he couldn't easily predict. Victoria felt a thrill at his words, a dangerous mix of satisfaction and anticipation. She knew she was treading a fine line. One misstep could reveal her motives, yet every careful move she made deepened the connection between them. As the evening progressed, their conversation drifted from work to more personal topics, family, childhood, aspirations. Victoria maintained a delicate balance, revealing just enough to seem genuine, yet withholding the parts of herself that would compromise her plan. She was careful not to smile too widely, not to laugh too freely, not to linger too long in his presence, yet the closeness, the intensity, the subtle electricity in the room made her pulse race despite her best intentions. Alexander, for his part, seemed equally conflicted. He was drawn to her mind, her wit, her charm, but he was also aware of the games being played, the subtle manipulations, and the fact that this woman had entered his life not by chance, but with purpose. Eventually, Alexander walked her to the door, the night air cool against their faces. The city lights stretched endlessly behind them, casting shadows that mirrored the tension between them. This isn't over, he said, his voice low, charged with meaning. Victoria nodded, her own heart betraying a thrill she hadn't anticipated. She left with a composed exterior, but inside, her thoughts spun like a whirlwind. The game was evolving, the stakes had escalated, and both of them were now entangled in a dangerous, intoxicating web neither fully understood. Back in her apartment, Victoria reflected on the evening. She knew she had to maintain her focus, her strategy, her control, but she also had to acknowledge a truth she had been suppressing. Alexander Blackwood was unlike anyone she had ever encountered. He challenged her, intrigued her, and in ways she didn't entirely understand, tempted her. The very rules of her plan were shifting, bending under the weight of his presence, and she realized that the one thing she hadn't accounted for was the effect he would have on her, not as a target but as a man capable of igniting desires she had long buried beneath ambition and calculated detachment. The following days brought more interactions, brief encounters at charity events, quick meetings under the guise of business discussions, subtle messages exchanged that carried layers of meaning. Each time, the tension grew, the attraction deepened, and the unspoken understanding between them became more complex. Victoria realized that what had started as a plan for leverage was evolving into a delicate, dangerous entanglement where strategy and emotion, control and desire, were all intertwined. By the end of the week, Victoria sat at her desk, reviewing every interaction, analyzing every word and gesture, plotting her next move. Yet, no amount of planning could entirely account for the pull Alexander exerted on her, the way his presence made her heart race, the subtle ache of anticipation she felt when she thought of him. She had entered this game thinking she could control everything, but she was beginning to understand that Alexander Blackwood was a force all his own, and that one night, one look, one touch, could change everything. The city had a rhythm all its own, but for Victoria, the rhythm now seemed to revolve around Alexander. Every time her phone buzzed with a message from him, her pulse quickened despite the part of her mind that reminded her of the stakes. She was walking a razor's edge, balancing ambition and strategy with a growing awareness that Alexander Blackwood was unlike any man she had ever encountered. He had control in his veins, authority in every gesture, yet there was a vulnerability in the way he looked at her that made her both cautious and dangerously curious. She told herself it was all part of the game. Never let desire dictate the moves, but each encounter tested that rule. That afternoon, she arrived at Alexander's private art gallery opening, an event that promised to attract the city's elite and powerful. She wore a fitted emerald green dress that spoke of understated elegance, her hair pinned to one side, makeup flawless yet natural. She had spent hours planning her entrance, knowing that every detail, from the color of her dress to the timing of her arrival, was part of a subtle strategy to capture attention without appearing calculated. Yet the moment Alexander noticed her across the crowded room, all planning seemed irrelevant. He approached her with that controlled calm that masked the storm behind his eyes, and for a heartbeat, the rest of the world disappeared. "Victoria," he said, his voice low, smooth, commanding attention without needing to raise it. "You cleanly outshine everyone in the room." His words weren't flattery. They were an observation, an acknowledgement, and perhaps, a challenge. Victoria smiled, feeling the faintest heat rise to her cheeks, carefully masking the thrill that surged inside her. She responded with measured grace, aware that this was another move in a game where every word, every glance, and every subtle gesture mattered. "I think the artwork speaks louder than I ever could," she replied, letting a hint of playful confidence infuse her tone. The effect was immediate. His eyes lingered on her longer than necessary, as if searching for something unspoken. Throughout the evening, Alexander and Victoria found themselves in a delicate dance of proximity and distance, each aware of the tension that crackled between them. Conversation flowed easily, laughter laced with a sharp intelligence, and subtle glances that suggested more than either would admit. She noticed the way he tilted his head when intrigued, the slight curl of his lips when amused, the way he leaned in just enough to command attention without overstepping boundaries. Every nuance mattered, and Victoria catalogued them carefully, aware that in this world, observation was as powerful as any direct action. But the game was evolving. The subtle pull between them was no longer purely strategic, it was personal, dangerous, and intoxicating. She found herself thinking about him in moments when she should have been planning her next move or analyzing the best way to gain leverage. She hated the vulnerability she felt creeping into her carefully maintained control, yet the thrill was undeniable. Alexander, on the other hand, was experiencing a similar conflict. He was drawn to her wit, her poise, her unyielding intelligence, but more than that, he was captivated by the challenge she represented. She was not a woman who could be tamed or predicted, and that unpredictability stirred a desire in him he had not expected to feel. After the gallery, Alexander suggested a quiet walk through the terrace that overlooked the city. The skyline stretched infinitely, the lights reflecting in the river below, painting a picture of elegance and danger that mirrored the tension between them. Victoria followed, heels clicking softly against the marble floor, each step a careful measure between poise and anticipation. The air was charged, heavy with a mixture of subtle tension and unspoken attraction. For a brief moment, they walked in silence, the only sounds the distant hum of the city and their own measured steps. Then Alexander spoke, his tone low and deliberate. "You're more complicated than I imagined," he said. "I thought I understood people, their motives, their games, but you're different." His gaze was fixed on hers, searching, measuring, and perhaps, revealing more than he intended. Victoria met his eyes steadily, carefully hiding the internal storm his words had sparked. She had learned early in life that vulnerability was dangerous, and yet, she felt a strange, undeniable pull in his presence. I prefer complexity over simplicity, she replied, her tone calm, yet layered with subtle intrigue. It keeps life interesting. Her words were carefully chosen, designed to intrigue without revealing, to charm without yielding. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the city lights casting shadows that danced across their faces, highlighting the tension that had been building since their first encounter. Victoria felt her heart quicken, her mind racing with calculations and strategies, yet unable to ignore the pull of desire that intertwined with her ambition. Alexander, equally aware of the danger and thrill, took a step closer, the proximity charged with unspoken words. He didn't touch her, not yet, but the subtle shift in the air was undeniable, a magnetic, irresistible force that neither of them could deny. Their conversations that night grew increasingly intimate, not in overt confession, but in subtle admissions of thought, philosophy, and experience. Victoria found herself sharing more than she intended, revealing glimpses of her true self between carefully crafted sentences. Alexander, in turn, allowed himself moments of authenticity, moments that blurred the lines between strategy and genuine curiosity. Every word, every glance, every pause became a part of the delicate web of attraction and manipulation they were weaving together. It was a dance of power, control, and desire, each step deliberate, each move calculated, yet neither fully aware of how far the dance would carry them. By the time the night ended, they were standing at the edge of the terrace, overlooking the city that had been both witness and participant in their subtle battle of wills. Alexander's hand hovered near hers, the tension between intention and restraint almost unbearable. Victoria's breath caught, her pulse racing, yet she maintained her composure, reminding herself that strategy was still paramount. And yet, deep down, she knew that each moment spent in his presence chipped away at her control, replacing it with a dangerous curiosity, a desire that neither of them were ready to admit. As she left that evening, the memory of his gaze burned into her mind. The rules she had meticulously constructed for herself, the boundaries she had promised never to cross, were already bending. Alexander Blackwood was not just a challenge, not just a target of strategy, he was a force that threatened to consume her calculated plan with an intensity that was both terrifying and thrilling. And she realized, with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, that the game she had started for power was evolving into something far more complicated, far more consuming, and far more irresistible than she had ever anticipated. The following week brought a whirlwind of events that tested Victoria in ways she hadn't anticipated. Alexander's invitations became more frequent, each one cloaked under the guise of business, philanthropy, or networking, but with an unmistakable undercurrent that suggested he was intentionally drawing her closer. Victoria knew the pattern. She could see the strategy behind his seemingly casual invitations, but the pull between them was growing stronger, undeniable, and dangerously seductive. She reminded herself repeatedly that she was in this for a purpose, a marriage of convenience, a calculated path to power. Yet, with each encounter, Alexander's presence chipped away at her resolve. She found herself anticipating his messages, wondering about his thoughts, replaying his words in her mind long after their meetings ended. Their latest encounter was at an exclusive private club, a place reserved for the city's elite, where Alexander had arranged a dinner under the pretense of discussing a new business venture. Victoria arrived early, choosing a seat strategically to allow observation without appearing eager. She had rehearsed the conversation in her mind, anticipating his questions, his reactions, even the subtle shifts in his posture that betrayed his attention. But as soon as he entered, all preparation seemed to vanish. He had a presence that demanded focus, commanding attention with a single glance, and Victoria felt the familiar thrill of being drawn into a force beyond her control. Alexander greeted her with that signature calm confidence, the smirk in his eyes betraying a hint of mischief. "You're early," he said, his voice low, teasing, yet undeniably deliberate. "I like that. It shows initiative." Victoria returned his smile with measured poise, feeling the rush of adrenaline at the subtle acknowledgement. "I like to be prepared," she replied, her tone balancing charm with professionalism, concealing the anticipation that churned inside her. The ease of their banter masked the storm beneath the surface, the unspoken tension that had been building since the first gala, the first dinner, the first spark of interest that neither had been willing to name aloud. Throughout the dinner, their conversation was a careful blend of business discussion and subtle personal probing. Alexander asked questions that seemed casual but carried weight, probing her ambitions, her thoughts on influence and control, her philosophy on life and power. Victoria responded with elegance and intelligence, revealing just enough to intrigue, to challenge, but never enough to give away the depth of her plan. And yet, despite the careful facade, there was a vulnerability she hadn't anticipated, an awareness that Alexander Blackwood's interest in her was growing beyond professional curiosity, that the magnetism between them was evolving into something far more potent, far more dangerous. The subtle games of power and attraction were intensified by the intimacy of the setting. Candlelight reflected off the crystal glasses, soft music played in the background, and the city's skyline stretched endlessly beyond the windows, a glittering testament to ambition and wealth. Victoria could feel the tension in the air, the delicate balance of control and desire, each aware of the other's intentions, each testing boundaries without crossing them. Alexander's eyes lingered on her in moments when she thought he wasn't watching, his gaze heavy with unspoken questions and a growing desire he struggled to contain. She noticed the slight tightening of his jaw, the way he leaned subtly closer when she spoke, the almost imperceptible shifts that betrayed the depth of his attention. After dinner, Alexander suggested a brief walk on the terrace overlooking the city. The night air was cool, and the soft hum of the city created a private world for the two of them. They spoke of art, of dreams, of ambition, of the fine line between power and obsession. Victoria maintained her composure, aware that every word, every pause, every glance was part of a delicate strategy, yet she couldn't deny the thrill of proximity, the dangerous pull of attraction that neither could ignore. Alexander, for his part, was becoming increasingly aware of the effect she had on him, the way her presence disrupted his control, challenged his authority, and ignited a desire he hadn't felt in years. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, they found themselves standing closer than either had intended, the city lights reflecting in their eyes, the tension between them thick enough to taste. Alexander's hand hovered near hers, almost brushing, and Victoria felt a shock of awareness ripple through her body. She told herself to step back, to maintain strategy, to remember the purpose of her plan. Yet, the magnetic pull was undeniable, the connection urgent and consuming. One look, one subtle movement, and the careful rules they had maintained began to crumble. Their conversation slowed, words fading as the weight of unspoken tension filled the space. Alexander studied her, searching for a sign, a signal, anything that might reveal her intentions, while Victoria fought to control the surge of emotions that threatened to betray her calculated exterior. She felt the intensity of his presence pressing against the walls of her control, and for the first time, she realized that her plan might be vulnerable, not because of missteps in strategy, but because of the very man she intended to manipulate. Alexander Blackwood was no ordinary target. He was a force that demanded attention, obedience, and, in a way that terrified her, affection. The moments stretched, the night growing deeper, the city lights casting shadows that danced across their faces. And then, without warning, Alexander leaned closer, the subtle heat of his proximity undeniable. Victoria felt her breath catch, her mind racing, her body betraying the control she had worked so hard to maintain. He didn't speak, but the message was clear, a silent acknowledgement of desire, of challenge, of a connection neither could ignore. She stepped back slightly, regaining composure, reminding herself of the stakes, of the game she had entered, of the careful plan that could not be compromised. And yet, the thrill lingered, an intoxicating mix of fear and anticipation that left her heart racing long after she had returned to her apartment. That night, alone in her space, Victoria reflected on the danger and allure of Alexander. She had entered this game thinking she could control every aspect, manipulate every outcome, and maintain the upper hand. Yet, the man who should have been her target was becoming something far more complicated, a force that tested her limits, challenged her strategy, and ignited desires she had long suppressed beneath ambition and calculation. She realized, with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, that one night, one look, one subtle touch had begun to shift the rules entirely. Alexander Blackwood was no longer just a challenge to overcome. He was a man who could unravel her with a single glance, a single word, a single act of unpredictability. Victoria knew the stakes had grown higher. The game she had planned for power was evolving into a dangerous entanglement of strategy, attraction, and temptation. She was no longer just playing for leverage, she was playing for survival within a storm of emotions and desires she hadn't fully anticipated. And she knew, deep down, that Alexander Blackwood, with his unyielding control and unexpected vulnerabilities, would continue to test her in ways that could either cement her dominance or destroy her completely. One night had changed everything, and the tension between them promised that the nights to come would be even more unpredictable, thrilling, and perilous. The following days were a blur of business meetings, charity events, and high-profile gatherings, but for Victoria, nothing mattered as much as the subtle currents that flowed whenever Alexander was near. The calculated dance they performed, intellectually charged, emotionally restrained, had shifted into a more dangerous territory, one neither of them fully controlled. She noticed it in the way he lingered in conversation, the intensity in his gaze, the almost imperceptible touch of his hand against hers when no one else was watching. Every move was a calculated risk, yet the thrill of it all made her pulse race in ways strategy alone could not explain. She was supposed to manipulate him, to play the game and gain leverage, but with every encounter, Alexander was rewriting the rules of engagement. Alexander, too, felt the change. He was used to controlling situations, people, and outcomes, but Victoria had a way of disrupting that control with nothing more than a glance or a subtle smile. He found himself thinking of her at odd hours, replaying conversations, analyzing every word, every nuance, and wondering how a woman so deliberate could make him feel so unpredictable. It was infuriating and intoxicating all at once. Alexander was not accustomed to losing control, or even entertaining the possibility, but Victoria had begun to chip away at his defenses, exposing a side of him he had kept carefully hidden from the world. Their next encounter came in the form of a private charity gala hosted at one of Alexander's penthouses, an event designed to impress investors and patrons alike. Victoria arrived in a sleek, ruby-red gown, her hair cascading in waves down her shoulders, and immediately she felt the magnetic pull of the room's atmosphere. The city skyline shimmered behind her as she entered, but all her attention was drawn to Alexander, who was standing by the grand piano, exuding the effortless authority that made him so formidable. His eyes met hers across the room, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. This wasn't merely attraction, it was recognition, challenge, and unspoken acknowledgement of the dangerous game unfolding between them. Throughout the evening, Alexander kept her close, guiding her through conversations, subtly orchestrating moments that allowed her brilliance to shine while maintaining the subtle tension between them. Their dialogue was sharp, layered, a mix of intellect and flirtation, each word calculated yet carrying the unmistakable undertone of desire. Victoria, despite her best efforts, found herself laughing more freely than she had in months, her mind momentarily unburdened by strategy, captivated by the thrill of his attention and the intensity of his presence. Alexander noticed, of course, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. She was slipping through his defenses, just as he was slipping through hers. Later, when the gala's formalities concluded, Alexander suggested a walk along the rooftop terrace. The city lights below painted a glittering canvas, the night air cool and crisp. Victoria felt a magnetic pull as they strolled side by side, the space between them charged with tension neither dared to acknowledge openly. Alexander leaned closer, his voice low, a teasing edge underlined with something more primal. "You're more than I expected," he murmured, his gaze never leaving hers. Victoria's breath caught. She had prepared herself for this, rehearsed every response, every controlled gesture, yet the magnetic intensity of his presence made her pulse quicken. "And you're more unpredictable than I imagined," she replied carefully, her voice steady but layered with subtle meaning. The conversation gradually shifted, their banter giving way to moments of silence, each charged with unspoken understanding. The air between them became thicker, every glance, every slight movement laden with possibilities. Victoria could feel the pull of temptation, the dangerous allure of a man who could read her like an open book yet challenge every layer of her carefully constructed defenses. Alexander, for his part, was acutely aware of the effect she had on him, the way she had infiltrated his thoughts, unsettled his control, and awakened desires he had long suppressed. He was captivated, intrigued, and increasingly aware that Victoria was not merely a player in his world, she was a force capable of rewriting it entirely. As they reached the edge of the terrace, overlooking the glittering expanse of the city, the moment between them stretched taut, a silent acknowledgement of the magnetic tension that had been simmering for weeks. Alexander's hand brushed lightly against hers, not enough to be a claim, yet enough to ignite a spark neither could ignore. Victoria's heart raced, her mind simultaneously calculating strategy and surrendering to the pull she had long denied. She reminded herself of her goal, the plan that had driven her from the start, yet the reality of standing so close to Alexander, feeling the heat of his presence, made strategy feel both trivial and impossible. He studied her, eyes intense, searching for signs of vulnerability, curiosity, or desire. Victoria held his gaze, every inch of her composed yet alive with the thrill of the unspoken game. The tension between them was electric, a delicate balance of power and temptation, and in that suspended moment, both realized that the rules they had been following were bending under the weight of mutual fascination. Alexander's usual precision, his controlled demeanor, his command over every situation, all were threatened by Victoria's presence, by her ability to challenge and intrigue him simultaneously. Their walk ended at a quiet corner of the terrace, away from prying eyes, and for a fleeting moment, the city's hum faded, leaving only the charged space between them. Victoria sensed that the next step, whatever it might be, would alter the dynamic entirely. She was no longer merely a player, she was now a participant in a delicate, dangerous, and intoxicating dance where control, desire, and strategy collided. Alexander's hand lingered near hers, his eyes fixed on hers, and in that charged silence, an unspoken agreement formed. The game was far from over, yet the rules had already begun to shift irrevocably. Returning to her apartment later that night, Victoria felt a swirl of emotions she hadn't anticipated: exhilaration, fear, desire, and the quiet acknowledgement that Alexander Blackwood was a man who could undo her with a single touch, a single word, a single glance. She had begun this journey thinking she could manipulate him, control the situation, and secure her future, yet now she understood that the game was mutual. Alexander was no longer simply a target, he was a storm she couldn't ignore, a challenge she couldn't resist, and a force that threatened to consume every carefully laid plan she had built for herself. Victoria sat at her desk, replaying the events of the night, cataloging every glance, every gesture, every word exchanged, aware that the stakes had escalated beyond strategy. The attraction between them was no longer subtle, it was potent, dangerous, and inescapable. Alexander Blackwood was a man who demanded control, yet in her presence, that control faltered. And she realized, with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation, that their encounters were no longer just about ambition or leverage, they were about something far deeper, far more consuming, and far more perilous than either of them had anticipated. The next morning, Victoria awoke with a renewed sense of purpose tempered by a cautious excitement. The stakes had never been higher, the game never more thrilling, and the man at the center of it all had become far more than an opponent. Alexander Blackwood was now an enigma she wanted to solve, a challenge she wanted to master, and perhaps, a danger she was beginning to desire. The game had shifted, and both were aware that one wrong move, or one daring touch, could change everything. The night had proven that the line between control and surrender was thinner than either of them had imagined, and neither could predict where desire, strategy, and power would lead them next. The week that followed was a blur of anticipation and subtle games, each encounter between Victoria and Alexander charged with the kind of tension that left her both exhilarated and wary. Every message, every glance, every carefully orchestrated meeting reminded her that the line between control and surrender was becoming perilously thin. She had entered this world with a plan, a marriage of convenience meant to grant her access and power, yet with every passing moment, Alexander Blackwood had begun to rewrite the rules. He was magnetic, commanding, and utterly unpredictable, and Victoria felt, for the first time in her life, the exhilarating terror of being caught in a force greater than herself. Their latest meeting was at Alexander's corporate headquarters, ostensibly to discuss an upcoming charity project, but both were acutely aware that the real purpose lay somewhere between strategy and the unspoken electricity that crackled whenever they were alone. Victoria arrived early, reviewing her notes, rehearsing her arguments, and preparing herself to maintain control over a situation that was increasingly slipping into emotional territory. Alexander, as always, was already present, exuding effortless authority, yet she noticed subtle changes, a slight softening around the eyes, a quiet intensity in the way he regarded her, that suggested he, too, was being drawn off course. As they walked through the halls, discussing projections and philanthropic initiatives, the tension was palpable. Victoria noticed the deliberate brush of his hand against hers when they passed through tight corridors, the way his eyes lingered on hers just a second too long during presentations, the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in his posture that revealed the depth of his attention. She fought to maintain composure, reminding herself that strategy came first, but every subtle touch, every glance, was a dangerous reminder that control was no longer guaranteed. Alexander, for his part, was fully aware of the magnetic pull she exerted, the way she challenged him intellectually, emotionally, and now, in ways he was only beginning to understand, physically. After the meeting, Alexander suggested a private tour of a new corporate project site. It was framed as a professional courtesy, but Victoria knew the truth. It was a deliberate invitation to spend time alone, to explore the tension between them in a setting removed from the public eye. As they walked through the sleek, modern spaces, discussing architectural designs and philanthropic possibilities, their conversation gradually shifted. Words became layered with subtle meanings, teasing undercurrents that neither could fully ignore. Every laugh, every brush of hands, every fleeting glance was charged with the energy that had been simmering for weeks, and Victoria felt her calculated defenses beginning to falter. At one point, they paused in a quiet corner overlooking the city skyline. The sunset bathed the room in warm hues, reflecting off Alexander's sharp features and highlighting the intensity of his gaze. He turned to her, his voice low, deliberate, carrying an edge of something unspoken. "Victoria, tell me the truth," he said. "Are you here only for the plan, or is there more?" The question struck her like a physical force. She had anticipated every possible scenario, every challenge to her strategy, but not this, the subtle, almost casual confrontation of desire and intent. She met his gaze evenly, maintaining her composure, yet inside, her heart raced. "Everything I do has purpose," she replied carefully. "But purpose can take many forms." Alexander's smirk was slow, deliberate, and charged with meaning. "Clever," he said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. "But purpose isn't always what it seems. Is it?" The air between them thickened, a delicate balance of power, curiosity, and attraction. Victoria felt the pull of him in a way that was no longer controllable by logic or strategy. She was caught in the magnetic field of a man who could read her like an open book yet remained entirely unpredictable, a man whose presence demanded surrender in ways she had meticulously avoided. They continued their tour, but every moment was charged with subtle tension, every movement layered with unspoken intention. Alexander leaned close to point out a design feature, and Victoria felt the heat of his body brush against hers. Her pulse quickened, a mixture of fear and desire coursing through her. She reminded herself that one touch, one glance, one lapse could jeopardize everything she had worked toward. Yet she also realized that the intensity of their connection was no longer simply a matter of manipulation, it had become something dangerously real, something that could not be ignored. Later, in the executive lounge, they paused to discuss final details. The room was quiet, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Alexander poured 2 glasses of wine, handing one to Victoria with a deliberate, slow gesture. The moment was intimate, charged, a subtle invitation that went beyond professional courtesy. Victoria felt the weight of it, the quiet acknowledgement of desire, and she knew that whatever happened in the next moments would redefine the game entirely. She lifted her glass with careful composure, their fingers brushing lightly, a spark igniting that neither could control. As they talked, the conversation shifted from professional matters to personal ones. Alexander shared stories of his childhood, moments of vulnerability that few had ever seen, and Victoria found herself drawn into a deeper understanding of the man behind the billionaire facade. She, too, revealed glimpses of herself, carefully measured, but enough to intrigue, enough to create connection. Every word, every glance, every subtle gesture deepened the invisible thread linking them, a connection that was no longer merely about power or strategy, but about desire, curiosity, and the dangerous thrill of surrender. Eventually, the moment reached its tipping point. Alexander leaned closer, his presence overwhelming, his gaze intense and unwavering. Victoria felt the magnetic pull, the irresistible gravity of him, and for a heartbeat, the rules she had constructed for herself threatened to collapse entirely. Her heart raced, her mind scrambled to maintain composure, yet she could not ignore the primal force between them. The room seemed to shrink around them, the city outside fading into insignificance as they stood on the precipice of something neither had anticipated. Alexander's voice broke the silence, low and deliberate. "One night, Victoria," he murmured, his eyes locked on hers, "and everything changes." The words were simple, yet carried a weight that made her pulse quicken and her carefully constructed defenses tremble. She realized, with a mix of fear and exhilaration, that their connection had crossed a threshold. The game was no longer simply about strategy, it was about desire, power, and the uncontrollable pull that existed between two people unwilling, or perhaps unable, to resist. When she finally left that night, Victoria's mind was a storm of thoughts, calculations, and unacknowledged desire. Alexander Blackwood had become far more than a target, far more than a challenge. He was a force capable of unraveling every carefully laid plan with a single glance, a single word, a single touch. She had entered the game seeking power and leverage, but now she realized that the stakes were higher than she had imagined. The tension, the attraction, the subtle battle of wills, it was intoxicating, perilous, and entirely consuming. One night had already begun to redefine the rules, and she knew with certainty that the nights to come would be even more intense, unpredictable, and irrevocably transformative. The night air was thick with anticipation as Victoria arrived at Alexander's penthouse, the city lights below twinkling like distant stars, a backdrop to a moment that promised to redefine everything. She had rehearsed her plan countless times, calculated every move, and yet as she stepped into his world, every strategy seemed both essential and futile. Alexander had invited her under the pretense of a business discussion, but the intensity in his eyes betrayed an intent far beyond professional matters. The tension that had been simmering between them for weeks now crackled with electricity, palpable, undeniable, and dangerously intoxicating. Victoria felt her heart racing, her mind a whirlwind of strategy, desire, and uncertainty. Alexander greeted her at the door, his presence commanding yet disarmingly intimate. "You're here," he said softly, a hint of something unspoken in his voice. "On time, precise, like I expected, but somehow, more." Victoria held his gaze, steady, composed, yet inside she felt the surge of anticipation and attraction that had been building for weeks. "I like to keep my promises," she replied, her tone measured, yet layered with subtle tension, a reflection of the delicate dance they had been performing. For a moment, they simply stood there, the charged silence between them heavy with possibility, a moment suspended in time where strategy and desire collided. Once inside, Alexander closed the door, the outside world fading into irrelevance. The penthouse, elegant and expansive, reflected his power, his control, his world, a world Victoria had sought access to and now found herself both a part of and at odds with. They moved through the rooms, discussing business in brief, but the conversation soon gave way to an unspoken understanding. Every glance, every subtle movement, every casual touch was loaded with meaning, a language they had been developing silently, a game without words yet entirely understood. The magnetic tension between them had reached its peak, and both were acutely aware that the next moments could change everything. Alexander stopped in the middle of the room, the city skyline behind him casting his silhouette in dramatic contrast. His eyes locked onto hers, searching, questioning, yet revealing a desire he had long suppressed. "Victoria," he murmured, his voice low and deliberate, "the rules, they're changing." His words were simple but heavy with significance. Victoria's breath caught. She had entered this game thinking she could control every outcome, manipulate every encounter, and secure her power. Yet now, standing in the presence of a man who commanded not just the room but her attention, she realized that control was slipping in ways both terrifying and thrilling. "Perhaps," she replied, her voice steady yet soft, "but some rules are meant to be rewritten." The tension between them was electric, each aware of the dangerous proximity, the unspoken pull, the intoxicating possibility of surrender. Alexander took a step closer, his presence overwhelming, his gaze unwavering. Victoria felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack, the thrill of anticipation coiling within her. She had expected to manipulate, to gain leverage, to play a role, but Alexander was proving that the game was mutual, that he was a force as unpredictable, as magnetic, and as consuming as she had feared. One touch, one word, one daring gesture, and the careful boundaries they had maintained for weeks could vanish entirely. Then, as if guided by the inevitability that had been building between them since the first gala, Alexander reached out, his hand brushing hers lightly, a deliberate, electrifying touch that sent a shockwave through her body. Victoria's breath hitched. She maintained her posture, her tone calm, yet inside, the surge of desire and anticipation threatened to overtake reason. "Careful," she whispered, half a warning, half a challenge. Alexander's smirk deepened, a reflection of the same thrill she felt. "Careful," he repeated softly, "has never been my strength." Their conversation slowed, the air between them thick with tension, desire, and unspoken understanding. Alexander moved just slightly closer, bridging the space, the magnetic pull between them undeniable. Victoria felt the gravity of him, the heat, the intensity, and for the first time, the rules she had constructed for herself, rules of strategy, restraint, and control, began to unravel. She realized that she no longer wanted control, not entirely. The danger, the thrill, the intoxicating allure of surrendering, even momentarily, to Alexander's presence was irresistible. Every instinct, every careful plan, every calculated move now existed in the shadow of a desire far greater than either could have anticipated. Then, as if the tension had reached its tipping point, Alexander leaned closer, their faces mere inches apart. Victoria could feel the warmth of his breath, the quiet rhythm of his pulse, the deliberate intent in his gaze. Her mind raced, a mixture of strategy and surrender, anticipation and fear. She had entered this relationship seeking leverage, seeking power, seeking a calculated outcome, but now, she realized that what she sought was no longer a plan, but a connection, a force, a thrill that was beyond reason. One night, Alexander murmured, his voice low, intimate, and everything changes. His words resonated deep within her, echoing the truth she had been trying to deny. The rules were broken, the game had shifted, and neither of them would ever be the same. Victoria's pulse raced as she considered the meaning behind his words. One night, just one night, could alter the course of everything. Yet she also recognized the inevitability, the pull of attraction, the dangerous thrill of surrender. She took a breath, allowing herself a fleeting moment of vulnerability, just enough to acknowledge the connection that had grown between them. Then let it change, she whispered, her voice soft yet steady, a subtle invitation that carried the weight of her own desires. Alexander's eyes darkened, a reflection of the intensity, the anticipation, the unspoken understanding that they were about to cross the threshold between strategy and surrender, control and passion. The city skyline behind them shimmered like distant stars, the night quiet and private, as if the world itself had paused to witness this moment. Alexander's hand found hers, gripping gently yet firmly, and Victoria felt the electric surge that had been building for weeks course through her. Every calculated move, every strategic plan, every careful facade had led to this, an undeniable, intoxicating collision of desire, attraction, and the inevitable surrender to the force that Alexander represented. The rules were gone, replaced by something far more potent, connection, passion, and the mutual acknowledgement that neither could resist. In that suspended moment, Victoria understood that she had not lost the game, she had rewritten it. Alexander was no longer simply the obstacle, the target, or the challenge. He was a partner, a force, a man who could match her intellect, her ambition, and now, her desire. One night had shattered the barriers, broken the rules, and set them both on a path where control, strategy, and restraint were no longer possible, replaced instead by the intoxicating thrill of surrender, the magnetic pull of attraction, and the unspoken promise of a connection that neither could deny. As they finally allowed themselves the closeness they had been resisting, the tension gave way to an undeniable force of desire and intimacy, a culmination of weeks of calculated strategy, subtle tension, and irresistible attraction. Victoria realized that the marriage she had planned as a tool of leverage had become something infinitely more complex, thrilling, and consuming. Alexander, for his part, understood that he had found in Victoria not just a challenge, but a partner, a woman capable of matching his power, intellect, and now, his deepest desires. The night stretched on, the city below shimmering endlessly, a witness to the culmination of their long, slow dance of strategy, attraction, and unspoken tension. They had crossed the threshold, shattered the rules, and surrendered to the force that had been building between them since the first moment they had met. Victoria knew, as she finally allowed herself to acknowledge the depth of connection and desire, that one night had changed everything. Alexander Blackwood, the untouchable billionaire, was no longer simply a target, a challenge, or an obstacle. He was a man who had lost control in ways neither of them could have predicted, and she, Victoria, had become an inseparable part of that transformation. The dawn of the next day would bring challenges, decisions, and consequences, but in that suspended night, Victoria and Alexander existed in a space beyond strategy, beyond ambition, beyond control. One night had broken the rules, forever altering the trajectory of their lives, their desires, and their hearts. The calculated plan had evolved into something real, dangerous, intoxicating, and irreversible, a bond that neither power, wealth, nor strategy could undo. And in that, both of them understood, the game was no longer about winning or losing. It was about surrender, connection, and the thrilling, unpredictable power of desire.